Hello and welcome to I'll Knit If I Want To. I'm Andrea Mowry of Andrea Renee Knits, and this is a little weekly podcast where I try my best to answer some of your questions. Today I am wearing my brand new cowl. This is called the Night and Day Cowl because it is knit up in Harrisville Yarns Nightshades and Daylights, which if you've never checked out those yarn lines, they are so interesting because Nightshades is a black based yarn. And I think there's 10 or 12, I think it's 10 different colorways in that line, but they all start with that black base and then they add in just like this sprinkling of color. So they have one that has like this blue hint, a red one. The one I used, I believe is called Static, and it has white added. And so it's just this really interesting concept to have this really dark yarn with just like this hint, this glow of color. And depending what you pair it with, it will kind of bring out that hint a little bit more. So I actually used Nightshades for my Ginny cardigan back a couple years ago, named for my grandma. And I used, oh, what is that one called? It was the blue one. And I love it because it kind of knits up like a navy. So it's just a really cool yarn. And then a few years later, they released Daylights, which is the same idea, but starting with a kind of an off-white. I wouldn't say it's like a white yarn, it's more of an off-white. And they did the same thing with adding like this little speckling of color. And again, they have like a red, a yellow, a green. So I used one that has a little bit of brown added, and it's called Caffeine, which I will admit, it was the colorway name that like really pulled me in. So I picked these out years ago when I was there teaching. And as you may have noticed with my framed cowl, I have been in this kind of monochromatic phase where I'm just loving kind of paring things down. I mean, I'm so drawn to color. It's really hard for me to not knit with like all that color, but it's been fun to kind of explore the edges of the scales, right? So anyways, this is the Night and Day Cowl, and it's really fun. I'm actually gonna tilt it for you. So this little scarf is, or cowl, is knit on the bias. So you can't really see the stitch pattern, how it truly is, because it's going at a diagonal. So I thought it would be kind of fun to hold it up so you can actually see. So it's basically like a checkerboard pattern, and it's created with just a simple slip stitch, which I think is so magical. And all of my testers did choose to knit theirs up, pretty much all of them, knit them up using some fun, colorful yarns. I will say I recommend going high contrast. If your contrast is too low, it will actually end up looking like the DRK Everyday Cowl, where you will just see these slip stitch ridges, but you won't really have the rectangles of color. Like it won't have as much of that checkerboard appearance. But anyways, it's a fun one to play with, and I hope you enjoy it. You can find the pattern links. It's always hard to get over my head, like with my headphones in. You can find the pattern links in the description box below as always. And let's go ahead and jump into some questions. All right, so first question, I'm knocking knits off my table here. First question is about the tessellated patterns. Okay, I plan to make the cardigan this fall, but I'm not too well versed in mosaic knitting, and I decided I would knit the Rad Plaid Cowl first to get a hang of the stitch pattern. I think that's such a great idea. My question is, do you have any tips or tricks for keeping the 3 balls of yarn from becoming a tangled mess? I'm only about an inch or 2 into the pattern so far, and I feel like I'm spending just as much time untangling as I do knitting. I'm hoping that there's some sort of trick on how to arrange the balls when switching. So I will say, I don't recommend any of the tessellated patterns as like your on-the-go project, because you are managing 3 colors. So if you're trying to pull, like keep the yarn balls in your knitting bag and you're just pulling yarn, they will wind around each other and become a hot mess. So it's definitely more of like, I'm gonna sit here for a while and knit project. And what I like to do is, one thing, you could put your yarn balls into one of these cute little sleeves. I've also seen people, if you've ever seen those like fancy fruits, like a pear, sometimes come in like these little mesh, like netting. Those work well also as like a cake holder. But this can kind of help your yarn just stay together and not blah, blah, all over the place. But what I like to do, I actually happen to have 3 yarn balls here, is I would take 2 of my yarn cakes and put them on one side of me, and then I would have another one on the other, and I would keep them separated like that. And what I really recommend doing is continuing to keep them organized as you knit. You will spend a lot less time untangling and messing with them if you slow down and take care of it in the moment. So what I like to do is generally when we are knitting in the round, like you will be in that Rad Plaid Cowl, we just kind of keep knitting in a circle. And so we keep doing this with our knitting. Well, what happens to all those yarn tails hanging off is they're winding and spiraling around each other. So eventually you have to go through and like unravel them all from each other, or you're gonna have a mess on your hands, especially as you continue to try and pull yarn through there. It's gonna like tighten up and be a mess. So what I like to do is when I get to the end of the round, instead of just continuing around, I stop and I rotate it back. So I'm going like this. And that way I am not spiraling my tails around me. Now, every once in a while, I found with all of those patterns that what I would need to do is there would be like one yarn ball that wasn't quite doing what I wanted it to do, even though I was taking care to do the flip back and forth. And so I would just reach through like my strands and grab it and put it back where it needed to be. And if you stay on top of that, it's not so bad, but I wouldn't leave it. And I certainly wouldn't leave them in your knitting bag because it can be a little bit of a mess. So it does take a little bit of forethought, and not even forethought. It just takes a little bit of patience to be like, okay, I'm not just gonna push through. I'm gonna make sure that I'm keeping them organized as I go. But I really do find using my body as a divider and having them separated, what happens is it keeps the yarn that's attached to all your balls, it helps keep them all separate. So if they do start to wind each other, it's just really easy to be like, if I had 2 here, it's just really easy to like reach through, grab that yarn cake and set it back down and just keep everything organized like that. And I found when I did that, it made it a lot less painful, and I could kind of keep my rhythm going without breaking it up too much. So I hope that helps. All right. I started the framed sweater in July and was apparently too excited to read the pattern notes carefully before casting on. I'm normally very careful. I had suspected my ribbing wasn't right as soon as I started it on the color work, but I checked and double checked the directions, and I knew my gauge was correct from my swatch, so I figured this was the intended look. I'm now at the shoulder ribbing, so they've knit through the whole thing, except for the sleeves. I'm now at the shoulder ribbing of the front yoke, and sure enough, my hem ribbing is wrong. Somehow I confused the needle size for the body and the needle size for the ribbing, and didn't realize it when I didn't even switch needle sizes between the two. So they basically used generally speaking, we tend to have about 2 needle size difference between our ribbing and the body of what we're knitting. So whether that is socks, hats, sweaters, we generally go down 2 needle sizes for our ribbing. So they knit the ribbing and the body all in their bigger needle that's meant for just the main fabric. I didn't even realize that I didn't switch needle sizes between the two. So now I'm way past the point of ripping back, but I'm concerned the final sweater will look silly and unbalanced with a ribbing knit in size 7. What are your thoughts? Should I finish the sweater and go back, put in a safety line at the knit row before the yarn changes and the color work starts, rip out the hem and knit it correctly? I would never have been brave enough to consider this normally, but I've learned a lot from your podcast and feel like maybe, just maybe, I can pull this off with a little help. This is only my 2nd sweater. Wow, great job. But I'm a confident knitter, just new to garments. Would appreciate your help. So, what I would start with is I would finish the sweater. I would then block it. I would then try it on, and I would just see for yourself. How do you feel about that ribbing? Generally speaking, none of us are going to know. So it's really up to you if it bothers you. Does it flare out? Does it kick out? Do you feel like it's doing an A-line thing that you don't like? Maybe it's going to do an A-line thing that you do like. So I wouldn't just like go straight in there and start doing sweater surgery now. I would wait until you're done, and then I would try it on, and I would see what you personally feel. Like, do you like it, or are you like, I don't know about this one. I think I'm gonna be really so much happier if I go and I tighten up that ribbing. So if it comes down to, I gotta tighten up the ribbing, I think you have two options here. One option would be to go and just snip into your cast on edge and unravel from there until you get to that one knit row, and then put your stitches back on your needles and knit your ribbing down from there. That is what I would try to do. The one thing you're gonna have to fiddle with, and it's not gonna be a big deal, is you're going in the opposite direction that you knit the body. And what happens is you're going to be half a stitch short. So when you go to put those stitches back on your needle, you're gonna notice that you have like one wonky bit that like isn't a stitch, but is it a stitch? Because you're going in the wrong direction. So if you think about your knits are all these V's, right? Going up, well, you're trying to go down. And so all you need to do is make that stitch. Just make it work. You'll never notice. It will be fine. I have done it. But I just like to let people know that's why provisional cast-ons can be wonky. When I'm doing a provisional cast-on, I actually cast on an extra stitch in there, and then I immediately decrease it out. But that means that when I go the other way, I've made up for that wonky half stitch situation. So just pick up a leg, make it work. It will be fine. You can always go in and tidy it up with like a duplicate stitch or a little tail of yarn if you feel like you need to, but honestly, I don't even think it's gonna be a thing. And then you make sure you put it on your ribbing needle and go ahead and knit your ribbing down, and then do a tubular bind off if you are doing the tubular bind off and cast on options for your pattern. So that's what I would do. Your other option would be that you could knit a new hem, get your needle into that knit row that we talked about, cut off the old hem and graft the new one on using like Kitchener stitch. So that is an option. I just think it's trickier. Personally, I think it would be easier to clip your cast on, and that undoing your cast on is going to be like the most finicky part of it. You have to get past that, and then it's going to unravel easier. That cast on, you're going to have to like pull. It's just going to be a little awkward. But that's what I would do, is I would unravel, get it on my needles, and just knit down in the opposite direction to do your ribbing. Good luck. You can do it. We all believe in you and are cheering for you. All right. Okay, that was the second question. Question number 3. I'm wondering if you use 100% wool to knit for your kids. Do you have yarn suggestions for kids? If you are using 100% wool for them, is itchiness ever a problem? So I have knit both my kids only a couple sweaters and quite a few hats and things. My daughter, who is 10 and a half, still wears a sweater I knit her when she was 2. She could really use more sweaters. She's great about wearing them. Both of the sweaters I have knit for her were knit in superwash wool. So they were 100% wool, but it was superwashed, and so it was very soft. And I don't think her skin's super sensitive. She's never complained, wears them all the time. My son, which it actually didn't occur to me until you asked this question, he finds wool to be itchy and does not wear his sweaters pretty much ever. He did wear one to school a couple times because he was so tickled that his teacher noticed, and he like told her I made it, and he liked that. But generally speaking, he's like, oh, it's itchy, I want to take it off. And I didn't think about the fact that actually both of his sweaters, one was knit in a commercial woolen spun, like pretty woolly yarn, and his other one is knit in my handspun, which is definitely woolly. And I never thought about it. Like, I definitely knit his in these really like kind of woolly yarns, and my daughter has these soft superwash yarns, so there could be something to that. So yeah, I mean, I'm not a big kid knitter. I knit mostly adult things for myself, but I will say out of my two kids, the one who got the superwash soft knits definitely wore them a lot more than the kid who did not. So that's something to consider. Also, if they accidentally end up in the laundry, which happens, you have a better chance of them surviving and not getting felted if that happens. So yeah, sorry, I just noticed a little bit of dust. I'm trying to think if I have any yarn suggestions for kids. To be honest, I use the same yarn for them that I would use for me. I don't necessarily buy anything special. I think if it was a baby, I would maybe put some more thought into that. But no, my kids, I've just always knit whatever I use. So one thing you could do is knit your kids like a little cowl and have them wear that and see how they do with that. And if they do well with that, then like a sweater is going to be no problem, because the neck tends to be the area that gets irritated. Like we almost bought my son a little turtleneck so he could wear his sweater because it was his neck that would get itchy. I need to knit them some more stuff. Need to do it. If anybody has any favorite yarns that they've used for knitting for kids, please feel free to throw them below. Okay, question number 4. I'm a new spinner and hoping to make your traveler cowl my first ever hand spun project. I have my first usable yarn I made in a Cheviot 2-ply, and to my horror, just learned that I might have spun my yarn the wrong way. So when we spin yarn, we spin our singles going in one direction, generally clockwise, but when we go to ply, we have to ply them in the opposite direction, generally counterclockwise, and this is called S twist and Z twist. So that's just a little information as we jump into the actual question part of this. All right, so I was told that Z twist yarns are for crochet while S twist yarns are for knitting, and I'm terrified that I will untwist my yarn as I knit. Is this true? Could I switch my style of knitting to save my project? Go from picking to throwing or throwing to picking? Should I chalk this all up to experience and for future spinning do Z twist singles and S twist plying? Maybe I'm making too big a deal out of this. Have you noticed a difference between Z twist and S twist yarns in your designing and knitting? Okay, so full disclosure, I have only ever spun my singles going clockwise and my plied yarn going counterclockwise. It's all I've ever done, and I do not stray from it because I do not want to confuse myself and forget what I have done and go in the wrong direction when I'm plying. So that is what I do. Honestly, I think it's gonna be totally fine. Yarn is not that fragile that you're gonna start knitting it and it's gonna start untwisting itself. That's not gonna happen. To be honest, the only time I ever have an issue with a ply kind of coming unplied, or even that's too short, but coming loose, like just like untwisting a little bit, is when I'm casting on. And especially if I have to cast on and then take it off and recast on because I counted wrong or whatever the reason may be. That is the only time I generally have noticed like a loosening of the ply. I've never experienced anything while knitting or crocheting that has affected my ply. Now, there are spinners, knitters, crocheters out there who love to get into like the nitty gritty of it all, and they might notice a difference, but I don't think most of us would. So 100% your yarn is usable. I wouldn't fret over it. I think the most important thing is to make sure that you are going opposite. So you're going one way for your singles and the opposite way for your plying. But if you don't really crochet and you do usually knit, I can't even, to be honest, I'm assuming I'm doing it the right way. I wouldn't even be able to say off the top of my head. But if that is what you heard or you read or anything, then yeah, maybe just even write yourself a sticky note saying, okay, like the way I think about it is like my wheel is turning in the same direction as the clock for when I'm doing my singles. And when I'm doing my plying, I make sure it's going the opposite direction. So that's kind of how I think about it. So I hope that's helpful, but I wouldn't fret. I think it's gonna be just fine. Okay. Question number 5. I am an experienced knitter, but a new spinner. I'm familiar with substituting one commercial yarn for another, matching fiber content, gauge, etc., but nervous to substitute commercial yarn with my own hand spun. Do you have any tips? As a new spinner, my yarn is still thicker or thinner in many places. Do you have advice for what to look for in a pattern that would make it more forgiving of hand-spun irregularities? My eventual goal is to spin and knit a sweater. So, there is actually a class you can take. I'm gonna make sure that I link that. Alana Wilcox has a class for substituting or trying to like replicate commercial yarns. So we'll say spin commercial. So you might be really interested in checking that out, especially if, again, you kind of like to get into the weeds a little bit and you want to really try to match something up. But generally speaking, I would say, in my experience, handspun yarns tend to want to bloom more than machine spun yarns. I have talked about this before where I think I've got myself a sport weight handspun, but when I start knitting it, it really wants to be knit up at a DK gauge. It wants me to go up in needle size because it just wants to and breathe once I'm knitting with it. So I will say that. I will also say, in regards to the thick and thin, you might be surprised by how much that can even out while you're knitting. Like, a lot of times I will think my hand spun yarn doesn't look very consistent, but then I'll knit with it and I'm like, oh my gosh, it just kind of works. It just fills in the gaps, it blooms beautifully, and it just works. Now, if you have big, thick, and thin spots that land next to each other, so thin and thin or thick and thick, yeah, you're gonna see some variation in there. But I also think that's kind of part of the delight of a hand spun yarn. And depending on how it is overall, it's not necessarily going to change your finished, like, dimensions of your finished fabric if it's still somewhat consistent. You know what I'm saying? Because it'll kind of even itself out. There might be a little bit of a thinner spot here and a thicker spot here, but it'll still create, you know, a certain size fabric where it should be fine. And the last thing I'll say, okay, I just went back to your question. One more thing I would say in regards to tips, do a 3-ply. If you can spin your singles to a thinness that will have your finished 3-ply be the weight you want it, a 3-ply is going to help make your overall yarn more consistent, because those 3 different plies give you a chance to even out your consistency as it wraps around itself, you know, a little bit easier than a 2-ply does. 2-ply, you have a higher chance of having 2 thin spots next to each other, 2 thick spots, or when you throw a 3rd ply in there, it's going to kind of balance those right out. So I find that when I do 3 plies, my yarn always looks more consistent and even. As far as advice for what to look for in a pattern that would make it more forgiving of hand-spun irregularities, texture. I would say texture is going to be a lot more forgiving than doing straight up stockinette. Straight up stockinette is going to create a flat fabric where you're going to see those inconsistencies a lot more, where doing something that has texture in it is really going to hide the inconsistencies behind the texture, or it's going to work with the texture to make the texture look even like more delightful and squishy. So that is what I would say. All right. That's all of our questions for today. Tomorrow we are hosting an Instagram Live, and it is our last one before the meetup on the hill. It's for Rhinebeck, our Rhinebeck knit along, our framed knit along, and it is our last one before actual New York Sheep and Wool Festival, which I cannot believe is next week. I can't wrap my head around it. This year is going by so fast. So if you're going to be at New York Sheep and Wool, can't wait to see you there. But if you'd like to tune in this weekend, I'll be hopping onto Instagram Live with my friends, Kate and Rachel from Spin Cycle Yarns and Candace from the Farmer's Daughter Fibers. And we're going to be talking about how to style our framed sweaters. So it's going to be a really fun one. And that's at noon Eastern Standard Time. So we would love to see you there. And then in the meantime, we have all kinds of knit alongs going on right now. The framed knit along's about to end, obviously, with Rhinebeck right around the corner. But there is the Insta-Friend knit along, which features my Hey Sailor pattern that just came out in September. And that will run until January 31st. That's solely on Instagram. So you can go to my account and kind of go through my grid and you'll find it, or to Shop La Mercerie, who is the host. And, or you can just use the hashtag InstaFriends, KAL 2024. Wool and Honey in Northern Michigan, Great Yarn Shop, is also hosting a broom sweater knit along. So that's going on right now. And we also have the DRK Spin It to Knit It knit along, which is going strong until February. And our annual fall knit along is right around the corner. So did I say? No. I'm like, did I just say the right knit along or the wrong knit along? I feel like I said fall knit along twice. The DRK Spin It to Knit It knit along goes till February. The fall knit along challenge is right around the corner in November. So of course we would love to have you for any of those, but I hope that you have a lovely weekend and I hope to see you back here next week. Bye.